Thunder cracked across the Blue Ridge Mountains like rifle fire, jolting William Thompson from his evening coffee. The 68-year-old Vietnam veteran's weathered hands steadied as lightning illuminated his cabin windows. Then came the scratching, desperate, urgent clawing at his front door. Bill grabbed his .45 from the kitchen drawer, muscle memory from decades past guiding his movements. Through the storm's fury, he heard something that made his blood run cold, a German shepherd's agonized whine barely audible above the wind. When he yanked open the door, the sight nearly dropped him to his knees. A massive dog collapsed across his threshold, its gray coat matted with blood and rain. But these weren't accident wounds. The cuts were too precise, too calculated. Someone had tortured this animal. As Bill knelt beside the dying dog, its amber eyes locked onto his with desperate intelligence. The shepherd lifted its head once, stared directly northwest toward the mountain ridge, then let out 3 short barks, followed by 3 long ones. SOS. Someone else was out there. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Bill Thompson carried the wounded German shepherd inside, his calloused hands gentle despite their tremor. At 68, the former Army medic still moved with purpose, though his knees protested every step. The dog was heavier than expected, easily 90 pounds of solid muscle beneath the matted coat. He laid the animal on his grandmother's old quilt by the stone fireplace, where flickering flames cast dancing shadows across the cabin's knotty pine walls. This place had been his sanctuary for 3 years now, ever since Martha's funeral. After losing his wife to cancer and watching their small Virginia town forget its veterans, Bill had retreated to these Blue Ridge Mountains, where his grandfather once hunted. The cabin sat 15 miles from the nearest neighbor, connected to civilization by a single dirt road that became impassable during heavy rains like tonight. No cell towers reached this elevation, just an old rotary phone that worked when the weather cooperated. Bill preferred it that way. Too many sleepless nights, too many ghosts from Da Nang, too many disappointed looks from people who expected him to get over it after 56 years. As he cleaned the dog's wounds with practiced efficiency, Bill noticed details that troubled him. This wasn't some stray that had tangled with a bear or gotten caught in barbed wire. The cuts were deliberate, precise slashes that spoke of human cruelty. Rope burns circled the animal's powerful neck, and its amber eyes held an intelligence that reminded Bill of the working dogs he'd known in Vietnam. "Easy there, soldier," he murmured, applying antiseptic to a particularly nasty gash. The dog's ears perked at his tone, not fearful, but alert, responsive. This was a trained animal, Bill realized. Those weren't random scars on its muzzle. They were the precise markings of a military or police K9. Thunder rolled across the mountains again, and the dog's head snapped toward the northwest-facing window. Its muscles tensed beneath Bill's hands, and it released that same urgent whine, 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. The international distress signal clear as day. Bill's blood chilled. In 56 years, he'd never heard an animal use Morse code. Someone had trained this dog well, and that someone was in terrible trouble somewhere up on that ridge. The question that gnawed at him as he wrapped bandages around powerful haunches was simple. What kind of hell had this dog escaped from, and who was still trapped in it? Outside, lightning illuminated the tree line, and Bill could swear he saw a faint glow emanating from the direction the dog kept indicating, too steady to be wildfire, too isolated to be campers. Dawn broke gray and sullen over the Blue Ridge Mountains, the storm having passed but leaving the world soaked and steaming. Bill had dozed fitfully in his grandfather's old recliner, one eye always on the German shepherd sprawled beside the dying embers. The dog had slept restlessly, whimpering and paddling its legs as if running from some nightmare Bill understood too well. When the first pale light filtered through the cabin windows, the dog's behavior changed completely. It struggled to its feet despite the bandages, limped directly to the northwest window, and began that urgent whining again. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short, over and over like a broken record player stuck on the same devastating song. Bill made coffee with hands that shook more than usual, the kind of tremor that came not from age but from recognition. He'd heard that exact pattern 56 years ago in a jungle clearing outside Da Nang, tapped out by a wounded radio man who'd lived just long enough to call for help that never came in time. "All right, soldier," Bill said, approaching the window where the dog maintained its vigil. "Let's see what's got you so worked up." Through his grandfather's old binoculars, Bill scanned the ridgeline where the dog kept staring. Dense forest stretched for miles, broken only by limestone outcroppings and the occasional deer trail. Then he saw it, a thin wisp of smoke rising from what should have been empty wilderness, too thin for a campfire, too steady for lightning-struck timber. His hands found the binoculars' focus, and his breath caught. Barely visible through the tree line stood the weathered gray logs of a hunting cabin. Bill knew that structure. His grandfather had pointed it out decades ago during their hunting trips, warning young Bill to stay away. "Abandoned since the 50s, the old man had said. "Roof's probably caved in by now, but someone was keeping a fire burning up there, and this dog seemed to know exactly who." Bill set down the binoculars and really looked at the animal for the first time in daylight. Beneath the mud and blood, he could see the telltale signs he'd missed in the storm, the alert carriage of the ears, the intelligent set of the eyes, the way it held itself despite injury. This wasn't just any German shepherd. The scars on its muzzle formed a pattern Bill recognized from his military days, the precise markings left by a service dog's working harness. "You're K9, aren't you, boy?" Bill murmured, kneeling beside the dog. "What the hell are you doing way up here?" The dog looked at him with those amber eyes that seemed to hold decades of secrets, then returned its gaze to the window. Its meaning was clear. Someone up there needed help, and Bill was the only one who could provide it. Bill's mind raced through the implications. A military working dog this far from any base, injured and desperate. A cabin that should be empty but wasn't. Someone keeping a fire burning who couldn't or wouldn't come down for help. The mathematics of the situation painted an ugly picture. Human trafficking, drug manufacturing, or worse. His rational mind screamed warnings. He was 68 years old, alone, with no backup and no way to call for it. The smart play was to drive into town when the roads dried out, tell Sheriff Bradley what he'd found, and let younger men handle whatever was up there. But the dog whined again, and something in that sound reached past Bill's caution straight into his soldier's heart. He'd left too many people behind in Vietnam. He'd buried too many friends who might have lived if someone had acted faster, pushed harder, cared more. Bill walked to his bedroom and opened the old Army footlocker that served as a nightstand. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, lay items he hadn't touched in years: his service pistol, 2 loaded magazines, a combat knife, and the first aid kit that had saved more lives than he could count. Beneath those, folded with military precision, was his old fatigue jacket, still bearing the faded patches of the 1st Cavalry Division and the small Purple Heart pin Martha had insisted he display. As he loaded his pack with supplies, the dog watched with increasing excitement. It recognized the preparations, understood what they meant. When Bill strapped on his grandfather's old hunting knife and checked his pistol's action, the dog actually wagged its tail for the first time since arriving. "You think this is a good idea, do you?" Bill asked, shouldering his pack. The dog stood and walked to the door, looking back at him expectantly. Despite everything, the pain, the exhaustion, the obvious trauma, it was ready to lead him back to whatever hell it had escaped. Bill opened the door, and together they stepped into the morning mist. The dog immediately set off northwest, not along any trail Bill knew, but with the confidence of an animal that had traveled this route before. As they began their climb through the dense mountain forest, Bill couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking toward something that would change everything. The last time he'd followed someone into unknown territory based purely on trust, half his squad hadn't come home. But looking down at the determined German shepherd limping steadily ahead of him, Bill realized he was about to find out if 56 years had taught him anything about when to fight and when to walk away. Behind them, the cabin grew smaller against the mountainside, and ahead lay whatever secrets the ridge was hiding. The climb up the ridge tested every one of Bill's 68 years. His knees protested each step over fallen logs and loose shale, while his lungs burned in the thin mountain air. But the German shepherd pressed forward with unwavering determination, pausing only when Bill fell too far behind, amber eyes urging him onward with silent urgency. 3 hours into their ascent, Bill called a halt beside a weathered boulder. His shirt clung to his back with sweat, and his water bottle was already half empty. The dog sat immediately, tongue lolling, but its gaze never left the path ahead. Bill studied the animal more carefully now, noting details he'd missed in the cabin's dim light. This wasn't just any working dog. The scars on its muzzle told a story of years in harness, and the way it moved, even injured, spoke of extensive training. Most telling were its eyes, alert, intelligent, and carrying a weight that reminded Bill of his own reflection. This dog had seen combat. "Where'd you serve, soldier?" Bill asked quietly, offering the dog water from his cupped palm. As it drank, he noticed something else, a small tattoo inside its right ear, too faded to read completely. Military working dogs were always tattooed with identification numbers. This animal had definitely served. They resumed climbing as afternoon shadows lengthened across the mountainside. The dog's pace grew more urgent the higher they climbed, and Bill began to smell something that made his stomach clench. The acrid scent of old wood smoke mixed with something else, something medicinal and wrong. When they finally crested the ridge, Bill's worst fears were confirmed. The hunting cabin sat in a small clearing, its logs gray with age and neglect, but someone had been maintaining it, poorly but consistently. Fresh chinking filled gaps between the logs, and a thin line of smoke rose from a makeshift chimney. Most disturbing was the heavy chain wrapped around the front door, secured with a massive padlock. The dog whined softly and pressed against Bill's leg. Whatever was in that cabin, the animal desperately wanted to reach it. Bill circled the structure carefully, his military training taking over. No vehicles were visible, but tire tracks in the soft earth showed recent use. The windows were boarded over from the inside, except for one small opening that had been covered with wire mesh. Through that mesh, Bill caught a glimpse of movement. Someone was alive in there. He approached the door cautiously, the German shepherd at his heels. Up close, the chain looked new despite its rust coating, a deliberate disguise. This wasn't some casual squatter situation. Someone was being held here against their will. "Hello?" Bill called softly. "Is someone in there?" The response nearly broke his heart. A weak, elderly voice, barely audible through the thick logs. "Please, help me." Bill's hands moved to the lock, but it was solid steel and beyond his ability to break. He'd need bolt cutters or a hacksaw, neither of which he'd brought. But as he examined the chain more closely, the dog began exhibiting strange behavior. It circled the cabin twice, nose to the ground, then stopped at a pile of firewood stacked against the back wall. Curious, Bill followed. The dog pawed at the woodpile, whining urgently. When Bill pulled away several logs, he found what the animal had detected, a small root cellar entrance hidden beneath the stacked wood. The wooden doors were secured only with a simple latch. Bill looked at the German shepherd with new respect. "Good boy, you remembered this, didn't you?" The cellar led to a crude tunnel that connected to the cabin's basement. As Bill crawled through the narrow passage, flashlight in hand, he could hear movement above him and smell the overwhelming scent of human suffering, unwashed bodies, infection, and fear. When he finally emerged into the cabin's main room, the sight that greeted him would haunt him forever. An elderly woman, probably in her 70s, sat chained to an old iron bed frame. She was emaciated, her gray hair matted, her clothes little more than rags, but her eyes, sharp blue eyes that reminded Bill of his late wife, fixed on him with desperate hope. "Thank God," she whispered. "I knew someone would come. I knew Sargent would find help." Bill's world tilted. "Sargent?" The German shepherd had squeezed through the tunnel behind him and now rushed to the woman's side, careful not to hurt her but desperate to reach her. She stroked his head with trembling hands, tears streaming down her hollow cheeks. "My boy came back," she said. "He came back for me." As Bill knelt to examine her restraints, the woman spoke in a voice made hoarse by thirst and shouting, "My name is Margaret Rodriguez. That monster who calls himself my son has been keeping me here for 2 months. He wants me to sign papers, to give him everything, but I won't. I won't let him destroy what Miguel built." The name hit Bill like a physical blow. Miguel Rodriguez, his closest friend in Vietnam, the man who died saving Bill's life in a jungle clearing 56 years ago. Bill had never known Miguel had family, had never thought to look for any after the war. "Miguel Rodriguez was your son?" Bill's voice came out as a croak. Margaret's eyes widened. "You knew my Miguel?" "He saved my life. I'm Bill Thompson, 1st Cavalry Division. Miguel talked about his mother all the time, but I thought, after the war, "You're Bill Thompson?" Margaret struggled to sit straighter. "My Miguel wrote about you in every letter. He said you were the best soldier he ever served with, said you kept the whole squad alive." The implications crashed over Bill like an avalanche. This dog, Sargent, somehow belonged to Miguel's family, had somehow found Bill, led him here to complete a mission 56 years in the making. It was impossible, but the evidence was overwhelming. "How did Sargent find me?" Bill asked, working at Margaret's restraints with his knife. "I don't know," Margaret whispered. "Derek, my other son, he hurt Sargent terrible when the dog tried to protect me, left him for dead in the woods. But somehow—" She looked at the German shepherd with something approaching reverence. "Sometimes I think Miguel's spirit lives in this dog. He always said he'd find a way to take care of me." The chains fell away from Margaret's wrists, revealing raw, infected wounds beneath. Bill's medic training kicked in as he assessed her condition: severe dehydration, malnutrition, and what looked like untreated diabetes. She needed immediate medical attention. "How long before Derek comes back?" Bill asked, helping her to her feet. "He comes every few days with food and water, just enough to keep me alive until I sign his papers." Margaret's voice hardened. "But I'll die first. Miguel left me this land, and I won't let Derek sell it to pay his gambling debts." Bill's blood chilled. A desperate man with gambling debts who'd already proven willing to torture his own mother and who might return at any moment. Bill's mind raced as he assessed their situation. Margaret was in critical condition, barely able to stand without support. The cabin sat miles from the nearest road, with no vehicle access and no way to call for help. Worse, Derek could return at any moment, and Bill had no idea what kind of man they were dealing with beyond someone desperate enough to torture his own mother. "We need to get you out of here," Bill said, supporting Margaret's frail frame as she swayed on her feet. "Can you walk?" "I'll try," she whispered. But her legs gave out after just 2 steps. Bill caught her before she fell, feeling how little she weighed, probably less than 100 pounds. 2 months of minimal food and water had left her body barely functional. Sergeant whined anxiously, moving between them and the door as if sensing approaching danger. The dog's behavior had grown increasingly agitated, and Bill had learned to trust its instincts. They didn't have much time. "Margaret, listen to me," Bill said urgently. "Is there anything here that proves Derek's been holding you? Evidence we can use?" She nodded weakly toward a corner of the cabin. "He keeps a journal, documents everything he's done like he's proud of it, and there's a camera. He films me begging him to let me go, says he needs proof I'm mentally incompetent." Bill found the items she described hidden beneath a loose floorboard. Derek's journal made for horrifying reading. Detailed accounts of psychological torture, calculated starvation, and explicit plans to forge Margaret's death certificate once he obtained the property deeds. The man wasn't just desperate, he was methodically evil. The camera's memory card contained hours of footage, showing Margaret chained and pleading, Derek taunting her with food and water, forcing her to watch while he burned family photographs and Miguel's military medals. Bill's hands shook with rage as he pocketed the evidence. "He destroyed Miguel's medals?" Bill asked, his voice deadly quiet. "Everything," Margaret sobbed. "All of my boy's letters from Vietnam, his Purple Heart, even the flag from his funeral. He said Miguel was a fool for dying for his country when he could have made money back home." Bill felt something cold and familiar settle in his chest. The same killing calm that had carried him through ambushes and firefights decades ago. Derek Rodriguez wasn't just a criminal. He was desecrating his brother's memory, torturing the mother who'd raised them both. Sergeant suddenly froze, ears perked toward the forest. A low growl rumbled in his throat, and Bill heard what the dog's superior senses had detected first, the distant sound of an engine growing closer. "He's coming back," Margaret gasped, terror flooding her face. "If he finds you here, he'll kill us both. He's already threatened to make it look like a heart attack." Bill quickly surveyed the cabin's layout. One door, boarded windows, and the tunnel he'd used to enter, which would be too slow for escape with Margaret in her condition, they were trapped, and Derek held every advantage except one. He wouldn't expect armed resistance. "Margaret, I need you to tell me about Derek," Bill said, helping her toward the back corner farthest from the door. "Military training, weapons experience. How dangerous is he?" "He was never in the service," she replied. "Miguel tried to get him to enlist, said it would give him discipline and purpose, but Derek was always looking for easy money, get-rich-quick schemes. He's a coward, but he's desperate now. He owes money to some very bad people." The engine sound grew louder, and Bill could distinguish it now as a truck or SUV navigating the rough forest roads. Derek was less than 5 minutes away. "Listen to me carefully," Bill told Margaret, kneeling beside her. "Whatever happens next, you stay down and stay quiet." "Sergeant will protect you, won't you, boy?" The German shepherd positioned himself between Margaret and the door, hackles raised and ready. Despite his injuries, the dog radiated lethal intent. Bill suspected that Derek had no idea what kind of trained killer he'd left for dead in the woods. Bill checked his pistol and took position beside the door, using the cabin's thick logs for cover. Through a crack in the boards, he watched a dirty white pickup truck lurch into the clearing. A man climbed out. Derek Rodriguez, about 50 years old, soft around the middle but with the nervous energy of someone living on borrowed time. Derek carried a paper bag, probably more minimal food for his prisoner, and moved toward the cabin with the casual confidence of a man who believed himself in complete control. He didn't even look around for potential threats. "Hello, Mother," Derek called out mockingly as he approached the door. "I brought you some crackers and water." "Have you thought more about signing those papers? My friends are getting impatient, and you know how I hate disappointing people." Bill watched Derek fumble with the padlock, keys jingling. The man was talking to his captive mother like she was a disobedient child, rather than a human being he'd been systematically torturing. There was something fundamentally broken in Derek Rodriguez, something that went beyond desperation into genuine sadism. The lock clicked open, and Derek began unwrapping the chain. "I hope you're grateful for my generosity," he continued. "Do you know what happens to old women who disappear in these mountains? Bears, mother, very hungry bears. The authorities would never even find enough pieces to identify." That was when Bill stepped out from behind the door, pistol drawn and pointed at Derek's center mass. "I think that's enough conversation for today." Derek spun around, dropping the chain and nearly falling backward. His face went through a rapid series of expressions: surprise, confusion, fear, and finally calculation. Bill had seen that look before, in the eyes of men deciding whether to surrender or fight. "Who the hell are you?" Derek demanded, trying to project authority he didn't possess. "This is private property. You're trespassing." "My name is William Thompson," Bill said, never wavering his aim. "I served with your brother Miguel in Vietnam. He saved my life, and I owed him a debt. Consider it paid." Derek's face twisted with something ugly. "Miguel? That idiot's been dead for 50 years, and you're just some crazy old vet who's probably seeing things that aren't there." Bill's finger tightened on the trigger, but he forced himself to remain calm. "Drop to your knees and put your hands behind your head. We're going to wait here until the sheriff arrives." Derek laughed, a sound devoid of humor or sanity. "The sheriff?" "Old man, there's no cell service up here, and the nearest phone is 20 miles away. It's just you, me, and whatever's left of my mother in there, and I've got some very important papers that need signing." That's when Derek's hand moved toward the small of his back, and Bill realized the man was armed. The moment Derek's hand moved toward his concealed weapon, multiple things happened simultaneously. Bill's combat instincts, honed by decades of survival, kicked in with lethal precision. Sargent, recognizing the threat to his humans, launched himself from the cabin doorway in a blur of gray fur and controlled fury. And Margaret, despite her weakened state, screamed a warning that echoed across the mountain clearing. Bill's first shot took Derek in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his pistol flying into the underbrush. The man dropped to his knees, clutching his wounded arm and howling in pain and rage. Sargent reached him a split second later, powerful jaws clamping down on Derek's good arm, not to kill, but to immobilize, just as he'd been trained in military operations. "Don't move," Bill commanded, keeping his weapon trained on Derek while the German Shepherd maintained his grip. "That dog has been trained to kill, and right now he's showing more restraint than I am." Derek's face had gone pale with shock and blood loss, but his eyes still burned with desperate fury. "You shot me! You crazy old bastard, you actually shot me!" "You drew on me," Bill replied coldly. "Where I come from, that's called self-defense. Where you come from, it's apparently called Tuesday." Margaret appeared in the cabin doorway using the frame for support. Despite her physical weakness, her voice carried the steel of a woman who'd raised 2 sons and buried one in service to his country. "Derek, what have you become? What would your father say if he could see you now?" "Dad's dead," Derek snarled. "Just like Miguel, just like you should be. This is all supposed to be mine. I'm the one who stayed home, who took care of you after Dad's heart attack, who never got to live my own life because I was stuck playing nursemaid to ungrateful old people." The raw bitterness in Derek's voice revealed layers of resentment that had been festering for decades. Bill recognized the tone. He'd heard it from soldiers who blamed everyone else for their failures, who never took responsibility for their choices. "So you decided to torture your mother instead of getting help for your gambling addiction?" Bill asked. "Real noble, Derek. I'm sure Miguel would be proud." "Don't you dare speak my brother's name!" Derek tried to lunge forward, but Sargent's grip tightened, and the man subsided with a yelp of pain. Miguel was the golden boy, the perfect son who could do no wrong. Do you know what it's like growing up in the shadow of a dead hero? Everything was always about Miguel. Miguel this, Miguel that. Well, where's your precious Miguel now, Mother? Margaret's face crumpled with grief, but her voice remained steady. Miguel is right here, she said quietly. He's in this dog who found help when I needed it most. He's in Mr. Thompson, who honored his promise to a fallen comrade. Miguel's spirit lives in every good deed, every act of courage, every moment when someone chooses to help instead of hurt. Derek laughed bitterly. You're delusional. There's no spirit, no grand design, no meaning to any of this. There's just money and power and the people strong enough to take what they want. Is that what you learned from your father? Bill asked. From the man who worked 2 jobs to put you through college? From the mother who mortgaged this property to pay for your failed business ventures? Derek's expression shifted, showing the first crack in his armor of self-righteousness. How did you— Your mother told me, Bill said. She also told me about the gambling debts, the loan sharks, the threats. But instead of asking for help, instead of admitting you had a problem, you decided to steal from the woman who gave you life. The sound of approaching vehicles suddenly echoed through the forest, multiple engines coming fast. Bill felt a surge of relief mixed with confusion. He hadn't called for backup, and cell service was non-existent up here. That would be Sheriff Bradley, Margaret said weakly, a small smile playing across her haggard features. I managed to activate the emergency beacon Derek didn't know about, the one Miguel installed before his deployment. It sends a distress signal to the county dispatcher. Derek's face went from pale to green as the implications hit him. The evidence of his crimes was overwhelming, and now law enforcement was minutes away. His shoulders sagged in defeat, the fight finally going out of him. The first sheriff's vehicle appeared at the clearing's edge, followed by an ambulance and 2 more patrol cars. Sheriff Tom Bradley emerged from the lead vehicle, weapon drawn but relaxed when he saw Bill's military bearing and the situation under control. Bill Thompson, the sheriff called out, we got a distress call from this location. What's the situation? 1 wounded suspect in custody, 1 victim requiring immediate medical attention, Bill replied, lowering his weapon but keeping Derek covered. This is Margaret Rodriguez. She's been held prisoner here for 2 months by her son. I have video evidence and documentation of the crimes. The paramedics rushed to Margaret while Sheriff Bradley took custody of Derek, whose wound was serious but not life-threatening. As they loaded both Rodriguez family members into separate ambulances, Margaret reached for Bill's hand. Miguel always said you were the finest man he ever knew, she whispered. Thank you for proving him right. As the emergency vehicles departed, leaving Bill and Sergeant alone in the mountain clearing, the weight of what had just happened began to settle over him. For 56 years, he'd carried the guilt of surviving when better men had died. Today, finally, he'd been able to repay a debt that had haunted him for more than half a century. Sergeant sat beside him, still alert, but no longer tense. The dog's mission was complete, his family safe. Looking into those intelligent amber eyes, Bill could almost see Miguel's approving smile. Come on, soldier, Bill said, scratching behind the dog's ears. Let's go home. The weeks that followed Margaret's rescue should have been a time of healing and justice, but tragedy has its own timeline that doesn't respect human plans or hopes. Bill visited Margaret daily at Blue Ridge Medical Center, watching her slowly regain strength under the careful attention of Dr. Sarah Chen and her team. The elderly woman's resilience amazed everyone. After 2 months of captivity and abuse, she was not only surviving but fighting to reclaim her life. Derek had been charged with kidnapping, elder abuse, extortion, and attempted murder. The video evidence from his own camera sealed his fate, and his court-appointed attorney was already discussing plea bargains. But as Margaret grew stronger physically, Bill began to notice troubling signs that her ordeal had taken a deeper toll than anyone realized. She would wake screaming from nightmares about being chained again, would panic when nurses approached with medication, and refused to be left alone even for minutes. The trauma counselor explained that prolonged captivity often resulted in complex PTSD, especially in elderly victims whose sense of safety and trust had been shattered by family betrayal. "She's fighting two battles," Dr. Chen explained to Bill during one of his visits. "Her body is healing remarkably well for a woman her age, but her mind is struggling to process what Derek put her through. The fact that it was her own son makes it exponentially more devastating." Bill understood trauma intimately. He'd lived with his own demons for 56 years, had learned to function despite the nightmares and flashbacks that still visited him decades after Vietnam. But Margaret's situation was different. Where Bill's trauma came from losing comrades in war, hers came from the ultimate betrayal of family bonds. Sargent had become Margaret's unofficial therapy dog, lying beside her hospital bed for hours and providing the steady comfort that human words couldn't offer. The nursing staff had bent the rules to allow the German Shepherd's visits, recognizing how much the dog's presence helped their patients' recovery. It was during one of these visits that Margaret made a request that broke Bill's heart. "I want to see him," she said quietly, her hand resting on Sargent's graying muzzle. "I need to see Derek before the trial." Bill looked up from the magazine he'd been pretending to read. "Margaret, that might not be—" "I know what you're going to say," she interrupted, her voice stronger than it had been since her rescue. "That it's too soon, that it might set back my recovery, that I don't owe him anything after what he did. But Bill, he's still my son. Whatever he's become, whatever he's done, I carried him for 9 months and loved him for 52 years. I need to try one more time to reach whatever good might be left in him." The meeting took place in a conference room at the county jail, with Sheriff Bradley and a victim's advocate present. Derek looked haggard in his orange jumpsuit, his wounded shoulder still in a sling, his face bearing the hollow expression of a man who'd lost everything through his own choices. When Margaret entered the room, supported by a walker but moving under her own power, Derek's carefully constructed defenses crumbled. For the first time since his arrest, he looked like the little boy who'd once run to his mother for comfort after nightmares. "Mom," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "I'm so sorry. I never meant for it to go so far. The debts were crushing me, and I was scared. And I thought if I could just get enough money to pay them off." Margaret slowly lowered herself into the chair across from him, her movements careful but deliberate. "Derek, look at me." He raised his eyes to meet hers, and Bill saw something pass between mother and son, a communication deeper than words. The bond that had existed before gambling and desperation and greed had twisted Derek into someone unrecognizable. "Do you remember," Margaret said softly, "when you were 8 years old and Miguel was getting ready to deploy? You asked me if I loved him more than you because he was going to be a soldier." Derek nodded, his voice breaking. "You said love isn't like a pie where each person gets a smaller slice when someone new comes along. You said it's like a candle lighting another candle. There's always enough flame to go around." "That's right," Margaret said. "And despite everything you've done, despite the pain you've caused, I still love you. But Derek, love doesn't mean enabling destruction. Love sometimes means letting someone face the consequences of their choices so they can find their way back to who they're meant to be." Derek sobbed openly now, the walls he'd built around his heart finally collapsing. "I destroyed everything, didn't I? Miguel's medals, Dad's memory, your trust in me. I became the kind of man who tortures his own mother for money. How do you come back from something like that?" Bill spoke for the first time since entering the room. "One day at a time, one choice at a time, the same way any of us try to live with the worst things we've done." Derek looked at him with something approaching hope. "Do you really think there's a way back from this? I've seen men do terrible things in war and then spend the rest of their lives trying to make amends," Bill replied honestly. "Redemption isn't about forgetting what you've done or being forgiven by everyone you've hurt. It's about choosing every single day to be better than you were the day before." Margaret reached across the table and took her son's uninjured hand. "Derek, you're going to prison. That's a consequence you'll have to face. But prison doesn't have to be the end of your story. It can be where you begin the hard work of becoming the man your father and Miguel always believed you could be." The visit ended with Derek agreeing to plead guilty to all charges and cooperate fully with the prosecution. More importantly, he committed to entering a treatment program for gambling addiction and anger management while serving his sentence. As they left the jail, Margaret leaned heavily on Bill's arm, exhausted by the emotional encounter but somehow lighter than she'd been since her rescue. "That was the hardest thing I've ever done," she admitted as they settled into Bill's truck, "but also the most necessary." Derek needed to see that his actions have consequences, but also that they don't define the totality of who he is or who he can become. Sargent, riding in the back seat, placed his head on Margaret's shoulder in a gesture of comfort and support. 3 months after Derek's sentencing to 12 years in state prison, Bill thought the worst was behind them. Margaret had moved into a small apartment in town, closer to medical care and the support network that had formed around her recovery. She attended weekly therapy sessions, had regained most of her physical strength, and was even talking about volunteering at the Veterans Center. Sargent had officially become her therapy dog, and the bond between them seemed to grow stronger each day. But trauma, Bill knew from bitter experience, doesn't follow a linear path to healing. Sometimes it circles back when you least expect it, striking with renewed force just when you think you've found solid ground. The call came at 3 in the morning. Margaret's voice on the phone was barely recognizable, high, thin, and fragmented with terror. "Bill, he's here. Derek's here. I can hear him outside my apartment. He's trying to get in." Bill's blood went cold. Derek was in state prison, 200 miles away. There was no way he could be outside Margaret's apartment, but the terror in her voice was real, even if the threat wasn't. "Margaret, listen to me," Bill said, pulling on his clothes with one hand while holding the phone with the other. "Derek is in prison. I spoke to his counselor just last week. What you're hearing isn't Derek." "You don't understand," Margaret sobbed. "I can hear his voice. He's saying the same things he said in the cabin, about the papers, about making it look like an accident. He's going to chain me up again." Bill realized this was a severe PTSD episode, possibly triggered by something as simple as a tree branch scraping against her window or a neighbor's television. But understanding the psychological nature of her terror didn't make it less real for Margaret. "I'm coming over right now," Bill said. "Keep Sargent with you, and remember what Dr. Chen taught you about grounding techniques." "Can you tell me 5 things you can see in your apartment right now?" There was a long pause, then Margaret's voice, still shaky but slightly more focused. "My coffee table, Miguel's picture, Sargent's water bowl, the television remote, the throw pillow you brought me from your grandmother's house." "Good. Now 4 things you can touch." Bill stayed on the phone with her while driving through the empty streets, walking her through the grounding exercises until her breathing slowed and the immediate panic subsided. When he arrived at her apartment building, he found her sitting on her couch with Sargent pressed against her side, both of them trembling. The next few hours revealed the depth of Margaret's ongoing struggle. The episode had been triggered by a documentary about prison systems that had been playing on her neighbor's television through the thin walls. Hearing discussions about inmates and rehabilitation had somehow convinced her traumatized mind that Derek had been released and was coming for her. Dr. Chen increased Margaret's therapy sessions and adjusted her medication, but the incident marked a turning point in her recovery. The episodes became more frequent, sometimes triggered by specific sounds, sometimes by seemingly random stimuli that her brain connected to her captivity. She began to withdraw from the social connections she'd been building, afraid that her craziness would burden others. Bill found himself becoming Margaret's primary caregiver, a role that both fulfilled him and worried him. At 68, with his own health issues and ongoing PTSD, he wasn't sure he could provide the level of support Margaret needed. But every time he considered suggesting professional care, he thought about Miguel and the promise he'd made to always look out for his friend's family. The crisis came on a rainy Tuesday evening in November. Bill arrived for his usual dinner visit to find Margaret's apartment door unlocked and Sargent pacing frantically in the hallway. Inside, he discovered Margaret in the bathroom, having swallowed a bottle of sleeping pills. The ambulance ride to the hospital was the longest 20 minutes of Bill's life. Margaret drifted in and out of consciousness, her vital signs weak but stable. Sargent rode in the back of the ambulance, his presence somehow permitted by paramedics who understood that separating him from Margaret would only worsen her condition. In the hospital waiting room, Bill confronted a truth he'd been avoiding. Margaret wasn't getting better. Despite therapy, medication, and support, the trauma of her captivity had fundamentally altered something in her brain. The woman who had raised 2 sons and worked as a volunteer nurse for 30 years was losing her battle with an enemy she couldn't see or fight, Dr. Chen found him there at dawn, still wearing yesterday's clothes and staring at nothing. "She's stable," the doctor said, settling into the chair beside him. "We got to her in time, and the pills weren't lethal in the amount she took. But Bill, we need to talk about what comes next." "She tried to kill herself because she can't live with what Derek did to her," Bill said flatly. "How do you come back from that?" "Some people don't," Dr. Chen replied with painful honesty. "Trauma changes the brain in ways we're still learning to understand. Margaret's experiencing what we call complex PTSD, complicated by depression and survivor's guilt. The fact that her abuser was her own son has created a psychological injury that may never fully heal." Bill felt something break inside his chest. Not his heart, but something deeper and more fundamental. "So what are you telling me? That we should just give up on her? I'm telling you that love sometimes means accepting that healing doesn't always look the way we want it to. Margaret may never return to being the person she was before Derek's abuse, but that doesn't mean her life has no value or that she can't find peace." The conversation continued for another hour, covering options for long-term care, residential treatment programs, and the reality that Margaret might need supervised living for the rest of her life. Bill listened to it all with growing despair, feeling like he was failing Miguel all over again. When he finally entered Margaret's room, she was awake and staring at the ceiling. Sargent lay on the bed beside her, having somehow convinced the nursing staff to allow his presence. "I'm sorry," Margaret whispered without looking at him. "I just couldn't carry it anymore. The weight of what he did, what I let him become. I failed as a mother, Bill. I raised a monster." Bill pulled his chair close to her bedside. "Margaret, you didn't fail. Derek made his choices as an adult man. You can't blame yourself for his decisions any more than I can blame myself for every soldier who didn't make it home from Vietnam." "But you do blame yourself," Margaret said, finally turning to meet his eyes. "I can see it in your face every time you look at me. You think you're failing Miguel again?" The accuracy of her observation hit Bill like a physical blow. "Maybe I am." "No," Margaret said firmly, showing more strength than she'd displayed in weeks. "Miguel didn't save your life so you could spend the next 56 years punishing yourself for surviving. And he wouldn't want you to sacrifice your own well-being trying to fix something in me that might be unfixable." They sat in silence for a long time, two trauma survivors recognizing hard truths about healing and limitations, and the courage required to accept both. Margaret's recovery took an unexpected turn in the weeks following her suicide attempt. Instead of the gradual improvement everyone hoped for, she seemed to retreat further into herself, spending most days staring out her hospital window at the mountains beyond. The psychiatric team had stabilized her medication and established a safety plan, but something fundamental had shifted in her spirit. Bill visited every day, sometimes bringing Sargent when the hospital staff allowed it. The German shepherd's presence still provided comfort, but even the loyal dog seemed to sense that Margaret was slipping away from them in ways that had nothing to do with physical health. "I've been thinking about Miguel," Margaret said one afternoon, her voice barely above a whisper, "about the last letter he sent before he died. He wrote about a dream he'd had, where he was standing in a beautiful garden with his father and grandfather, all the Rodriguez men who'd gone before him. He said it felt like coming home." Bill shifted uncomfortably in his chair. These conversations about death and reunion had become more frequent, and they worried him. "Margaret, Miguel also wrote about coming home to you, about the life he wanted to build after the war." "He never got that chance," she replied, still gazing out the window. "But maybe that's not how it works. Maybe the life we're meant to live isn't always the one we plan." Dr. Chen had warned Bill about this phase of trauma recovery, a kind of spiritual exhaustion where survivors questioned whether the effort to heal was worth the pain of continuing. Margaret wasn't actively suicidal anymore, but she seemed to be losing her will to fight for recovery. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Derek had been writing letters from prison, tentative at first, then with growing frequency as his own therapy progressed. Margaret had refused to read them, asking Bill to simply throw them away. But on this particular Tuesday, something made Bill open the latest envelope before discarding it. The letter was different from Derek's previous attempts at apology. Instead of focusing on his own remorse and rehabilitation, Derek had written about Margaret, about memories of her strength, her kindness, her unwavering faith in the possibility of human goodness, even when faced with cruelty. "Mom," the letter read, "I know you probably won't read this, and I understand why. But I needed to tell you something I learned in group therapy yesterday. Our counselor asked us to write about the person who taught us what love looks like, even if we forgot that lesson along the way. I wrote about you. I wrote about how you worked double shifts at the hospital so Miguel and I could have new school clothes. How you never missed a single one of my baseball games, even when you were exhausted. How you cried with joy when I graduated college, and how you never gave up on me, even when I gave you every reason to. The therapist asked me why I thought you kept loving me despite everything I did wrong, even before the cabin. I realized it wasn't because you were weak or naive. It was because you understood something I forgot. That love isn't something you earn or lose based on your actions. It's something you choose to give over and over again, especially when it's hardest to give. I can't undo what I did to you. I can't give you back the months of fear and pain I caused. But I can promise you this. I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to become worthy of the love you gave me for 52 years. Not so you'll forgive me. I don't deserve that. But so Miguel's little brother can finally grow up to be half the man you raised him to be." Bill read the letter aloud to Margaret, watching her face for any sign of reaction. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but for the first time in months they seemed to carry something other than despair. "He remembers," she whispered. "After everything that happened, he still remembers who we used to be." That evening, Margaret made a decision that surprised everyone. She asked Dr. Chen to arrange a video call with Derek, not for closure or forgiveness, but to tell him something important. The call took place in a private room with Bill and a counselor present. Derek appeared on screen looking older than his 52 years, his face bearing the weight of genuine remorse and the hard work of confronting his demons. "Derek," Margaret said, her voice steadier than it had been in months, "I need you to know something. What you did to me in that cabin was evil. It nearly destroyed my mind and my will to live. I may never fully recover from it." Derek's face crumpled, but Margaret continued, "But you are not evil. You made evil choices because you were lost and desperate and forgot who you really are. The Derek I raised is still in there somewhere, and that Derek is worth saving." "Mom, I don't know how to live with what I did to you," Derek sobbed. "The same way I'm learning to live with what was done to me," Margaret replied. "One day at a time, one choice at a time, with help from people who care about us. You can't undo the past, son, but you can still choose what kind of man you become from this moment forward." The conversation lasted only 20 minutes, but its impact on Margaret was profound. Something that had been broken inside her, not healed, but no longer hemorrhaging hope, began to stabilize. "I realized something today," she told Bill as they sat in the hospital garden afterward. "I've been so focused on trying to get back to who I was before the cabin that I never considered who I might become because of it. Maybe this trauma doesn't have to be the end of my story. Maybe it can be the beginning of a different chapter." Sargent lay at her feet, his graying muzzle resting on her shoes as if anchoring her to this newfound resolve. "What does that look like?" Bill asked. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, watching the sun set behind the mountains where her ordeal had begun and ended. "I don't know yet, but I know it doesn't look like giving up. And I know it includes helping other people who've survived what I survived. Maybe that's how we honor the people we've lost, by using our pain to ease someone else's." For the first time since Margaret's rescue, Bill felt something that had been absent for months. Hope. Not the naive hope that everything would return to how it was before, but the mature hope that something meaningful could still be built from the pieces of what remained. 6 months later, Bill stood in the community center parking lot, adjusting his tie and feeling more nervous than he had before any combat mission. Tonight marked the grand opening of the Rodriguez Veterans Support Center, named in honor of Miguel and funded through Margaret's property sale. The modest building would house support groups, therapy services, and emergency housing for veterans struggling with PTSD and readjustment challenges. Margaret emerged from the passenger seat of his truck, moving slowly but confidently with her walking cane. The months of intensive therapy had transformed her, not back to who she was before Derek's betrayal, but into someone new and purposeful. Her hair was styled, she wore a navy blue dress that brought out her eyes, and most importantly, she carried herself with the dignity of a woman who had survived hell and chosen to help others navigate their own darkness. Sargent trotted beside them, his service dog Vest marking his new role as a certified therapy animal. The German Shepherd had completed professional training and now worked with veterans whose trauma manifested in ways similar to his own experiences. His presence provided comfort to men and women who understood the unique bond between warriors, both human and canine. "Are you ready for this?" Bill asked Margaret as they approached the building's entrance, where a small crowd had gathered for the ribbon-cutting ceremony. "I've been ready for this my entire life," she replied, her voice steady with conviction. "I just didn't know it until now." The crowd included Sheriff Bradley, Dr. Chen, several veterans from the surrounding counties, and representatives from the state's Department of Veterans Affairs. But the most significant attendee appeared on a large video screen inside the building, Derek, participating from the prison's video conference room. Derek had changed dramatically during his incarceration. His face carried the weight of genuine remorse, but also something Bill recognized from his own journey, the hard-earned peace that comes from accepting responsibility and finding purpose beyond personal pain. He'd completed addiction treatment, earned his GED, and was working toward a bachelor's degree in social work. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sheriff Bradley began, "we're here tonight to celebrate something remarkable. The transformation of tragedy into hope, of survival into service. Margaret Rodriguez has taken her experience as a victim of abuse and transformed it into a beacon of healing for our community's veterans." Margaret stepped forward to cut the ribbon, her hands steady despite the magnitude of the moment. As the crowd applauded, she spoke quietly but clearly. "This center exists because sometimes the worst things that happen to us can become the source of our greatest strength. Not because trauma is good, but because we can choose to use our pain to help others heal." The first support group meeting took place that very evening. 8 veterans attended, ranging in age from 25 to 73, representing conflicts from Vietnam to Afghanistan. Bill found himself serving as group facilitator, a role he'd never imagined but somehow felt called to fill. "Recovery isn't about forgetting what happened to us," Bill told the group as they sat in a circle with Sargent moving among them, offering comfort where needed. "It's about learning to carry our experiences in a way that makes us stronger instead of breaking us down. Some days you'll feel like you're winning that battle, and some days you'll feel like you're losing. But showing up here, choosing to try again tomorrow, that's what courage really looks like." A young Marine named Sarah, back from her 3rd deployment in Iraq, spoke up. "How do you know when you're actually getting better versus just pretending to be okay?" Margaret, who'd been quietly observing, leaned forward. "You know you're healing when you can help someone else without it destroying you, when your pain becomes a bridge instead of a wall." The conversation continued for 2 hours, with stories shared, tears shed, and connections made between people who understood each other's struggles in ways that no textbook could teach. Bill watched Margaret facilitate discussions with the skill of someone who'd learned empathy through fire. And he realized that Miguel's spirit truly did live on, not just in Sargent's loyalty or Bill's sense of duty, but in this multiplication of healing that rippled outward from their shared trauma. Derek's voice came through the speakers as the meeting concluded. "Mom, I can see what you've built there, and I'm so proud of you. You took the worst thing I ever did and turned it into something beautiful. That's who you really are. Not the woman I heard in that cabin, but the woman who refused to let that be the end of her story." "And you're not the man who hurt me," Margaret replied, looking directly at the camera. "You're the son who's choosing to become better every day. That's who you really are." As the group members said their goodbyes and made plans to return next week, Bill realized that this was what healing actually looked like. Not the absence of scars, but the transformation of wounds into wisdom, of isolation into community, of despair into purpose. Walking Margaret to his truck under a canopy of stars, Bill felt something he hadn't experienced since Martha's death, a sense of belonging to something larger than his own pain. Sargent padded beside them, no longer just a companion animal, but a bridge between worlds, connecting past and present, trauma and healing, loss and renewal. "Miguel would be proud of what we've built here," Margaret said as they drove through the quiet mountain roads toward home. "He'd be proud of what you've built," Bill corrected. "I'm just grateful you let me help." "Oh, Bill," Margaret laughed. The first genuine laughter he'd heard from her since her rescue. "Don't you see? None of us is doing this alone. Miguel's still here in every life this center touches, in every veteran who finds hope instead of despair. Sargent found you, you found me, and now we're all finding ways to heal together. That's not coincidence. That's love continuing its work long after we thought the story was over." Bill pulled into Margaret's driveway, where lights glowed warmly in the windows of the small house she'd purchased near the center. It wasn't the grand family home she'd lost to Derek's schemes, but it was hers, filled with purpose and peace. "Same time tomorrow?" he asked, knowing that the center's success would require daily attention and care. "Wouldn't miss it," Margaret replied, then paused with her hand on the door handle. "Bill, thank you for not giving up on me when I couldn't see past my own pain. Thank you for believing that healing was possible even when I didn't." As Bill watched her walk safely to her front door, Sargent at her side, he realized that redemption wasn't about erasing the past or returning to some previous version of yourself. It was about moving forward with purpose, carrying your scars as evidence of survival rather than symbols of defeat. The Rodriguez Veterans Support Center would help hundreds of people in the years to come, but its first and most important healing had already taken place, in the hearts of 3 souls who'd found their way back to hope through the simple act of refusing to give up on each other. Sometimes the heaviest chains we carry aren't made of metal, but of pain we think we have to bear alone. Bill and Margaret discovered that healing doesn't mean forgetting our wounds. It means transforming them into bridges that help others cross their own dark valleys. Their story reminds us that our greatest traumas can become our most powerful tools for helping others, and that it's never too late to write a new chapter filled with purpose and hope. Whether you've served in uniform or fought battles on the home front, your experiences, both the victories and the defeats, can become sources of strength for someone else who's struggling to find their way. What experience in your own life, even a difficult one, has taught you something valuable that could help another person? Have you ever found healing by helping others work through challenges similar to your own? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.